Welcome everybody, so great to see so many of you. I want to start with a very quick question. Since the beginning of the year, how many of you would say you've used something that's part of the sharing economy, Airbnb or Uber or Handyman or anything like that? That's a pretty decent amount. It's well over half of you, And I think that speaks to something. Our economies are changing. They're changing, and in ways that we had really not imagined just a few short years ago. Now, what is the sharing economy? There's lots of different definitions to this, and I think it's quite important to try to get something down here. And I wrote a little definition myself. I made this one up. Probably my speakers might disagree with it. But I think it includes a very wide range of economic activity, often about assets being rented or shared, sometimes for profit, sometimes not for profit, typically via online platforms which facilitate interactions between people who are strangers. Now that to me is what the sharing economy is. And I remember when I first came across Uber or Airbnb, and I couldn't believe it. What an amazing service. And for so many of its proponents, it has incredible, obviously, sort of fantastic ways that allow people to get around very quickly and easily and often cheaply. Environmental benefits, potentially. Maybe for its most ardent activists and supporters, a brand new way of structuring an economy in a much more peer-to-peer based way. But for its critics, however, this sharing economy is just the same old capitalist stuff we've seen before with a nice new word attached to it. And we see all the risk being passed on to the employers. We see the profits of this being scooped up by a tiny number of people on the top. This is one of the great debates of our time. So I am really delighted we are going to be debating it today. Now, you should all have a couple of little cards. You've probably sat on them, haven't you? You've seen them. And it frames exactly the debate. Let's get real. The sharing economy is not about sharing. That is our motion tonight. And we are going to have two speakers which will be speaking for that motion, and we'll be having two speakers speaking against that motion. So let me introduce those speakers for you. So speaking for the motion, it's a bit complicated, isn't it? Because it's like a negative, this motion. You're going to have to concentrate very hard, audience, okay? Speaking for the motion, that is to say that we agree, yes, the sharing economy is not about sharing. We're going to have Michel Bowens, who is the founder and director of the P2P. Is it P2P or peer-to-peer? It's P2P, isn't it? Peer-to-peer. The Peer-to-Peer Foundation, which looks at all of these issues, particularly how you can restructure economic and social activity around peer-to-peer principles. We have Steve Keen, who is a renegade economist, who is apparently, I've just heard out the back there, the first professor who is going to be fully funded by Patreon. And you can find that, I wrote this down, patreon.com/Prof Steve Keen. Also has a couple of books over there and is a professor at both Kingston and is it Imperial or UCL? UCL. Arguing against the motion. So against the motion. We have Juliet Shaw here to my immediate left, who is a professor of sociology from Boston University and who has been researching this subject for longer than most of us have even heard this word. You should read some of her stuff, it's fantastic. I'm not biased, by the way. I'm completely neutral in this discussion. And we have Judith Wallenstein, who is from Boston Consulting Group and who currently runs the Henderson Institute, which is the European sort of internal think tank of the Boston Consulting Group. Now, it's men versus women, and we didn't mean to make that happen on International Women's Day. They're not going to need any help, believe me, so don't let that change your views at all. And I'm just going to try to get quickly to understand exactly the format. We're going to hear from each speaker in turn. They're going to have between 8 and 10 minutes to state their case. And then we're going to go to the audience, and you get your chance to speak and what you think. You can contribute, you can ask questions, but you have just 1 minute each to do that. I'm not going around each person for 1 minute, don't worry, but no more than 1 minute. And then we're going to come back with some concluding remarks. Now, before we start, there's one final thing I want you to do. You have these, we might not need these, but I want to find out before we go what the mood of the room is about this debate. So, let's get real. The sharing economy is not about sharing. Put your hands up if you agree with the motion. Oh, that's close. That's pretty close, isn't it? Do we need to do a count? I think we need a count. Right. If all those that agree, get those white cards in your hands. The white cards, you are the white cards. You agree with this. And please pass them down, and we're going to count them up. Pass them down, and we're going to count them up. Both sides, it doesn't matter which way. Pass them down to that side from the middle. We're going to part the waves here from the middle. We are going to count them up. We don't need the results right now, do we? We're going to count them up, and then, of course, at the end, we're going to have another vote. And we're going to see whether or not the motion has carried. Are we done? We're done. It doesn't matter if you've got yellow and white. I think everybody who's had their card has passed them off. Okay. Right. Ladies and gentlemen, are we ready? Yes, we're ready. We're going to start off with our first speaker. It is Michel Bowens, and he is arguing for the motion. Michel. Would you mind standing?
Oh, standing, yes, we said that, I forgot already. I guess it's fairly easy to actually argue against that, for the motion, right? For the motion against the sharing economy. But it's important that, so I'm going to use the word sharing economy, meaning the mainstream not sharing economy. But we should not forget that there is a real sharing economy as well, which I will call the commons economy. But that will be for the end of my intervention. Okay, so obviously renting and selling, I'm sorry, it's not sharing. It's just as simple as that. There's nothing about sharing in this sharing economy. It's about renting and selling. So what it is about? It's about two things. And these two things are not bad in themselves. They're actually very good. So I'm giving a bit ammunition to the other side here. So it's about the mutualization of underused resources. And definitely we need to do this, right? We need to use less matter and energy from our planet. So we need to use more the same resources. We need to use less. So that's good. Second thing, direct contact between supply and demand through platforms. I think that's also a good thing. So I'm giving you a lot of ammunition already. So what's wrong about it? It's the way they do it. And the way they do it, they actually undermine the promise of those two things. And I'm going to argue for that. So it's important, so I use the language generative and extractive. Yeah? So think about farmers. Farmers use pesticides and all kinds of stuff. And every year they work, the soil is poorer than the year before. That's an extractive form of farming. What about a farmer who nourishes his soil and every year the soil is better and better, like an agroecological farmer? He's a generative farmer. He makes the soil better year after year. So the same about resources and people in general. Do these sharing economy companies, so-called sharing economy companies like Uber, Airbnb, are they generative according, to the people and resources that they're mobilizing? And the answer is probably no. And actually, it is no. We know this. So first of all, precarity. It's not the old capitalism. It's much worse than the old capitalism. The old capitalism hires people, pays them a wage, and then makes a surplus, and it lives from the surplus. The new capitalism doesn't produce anything. Uber doesn't produce housing. Airbnb doesn't produce housing. Uber doesn't produce cars or transport. They make us produce cars. And they extract a huge amount of toll. It's like a medieval toll booth, in between those exchanges. And then even worse, if you look at Facebook, they would be worth exactly nothing without us, and 100% of the market value is extracted from us, and nothing goes back. So these companies are actively impoverishing our societies. They're creating precarious. They didn't invent it, but they're reinforcing it. And there's a famous researcher called Judith Shore, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, who just told me that the average person who lives full-time of these jobs only earns about $20,000 a year. And you can't make a living from that in Western societies. So thank you for the ammunition for that. So this is a gift economy. It circulates between us. So let me go to the market-making function. It's already late? No, okay, because it's 10 minutes like nothing for me. All right, so they say, of course, that they bring together supply and demand in an open information environment. It's not true. The private platforms are systematically making it difficult for supply to organize and mutualize itself, and they reinforce the force of the demand side. So that means that workers cannot negotiate, cannot communicate over these platforms. They actually do, around it. There's lots of Uber groups that do that, but it's against the rules of the company. So the companies put a constant pressure on the level of income on the labor and the services that are supplied on these platforms. Very, very dangerous, I think, in a democratic society is that they are corporate sovereigns. What do I mean? You probably know that Denmark opened some kind of embassy, towards these big companies. And so think about what you probably read about Uber. So the first thing is they had this thing called Grey Wolf, which is a software that when they went into a city that didn't want them, they would get all the names of the functionaries and then give them a fake Uber application with fake cars so they could never catch. This is illegal. This is like really banditry. And what it means is they don't recognize the public sphere. They don't recognize democratic regulation and legislation. They are transnational corporate sovereigns that do not recognize democratic legitimacy. The other thing that was found out just a few weeks ago in Canada is whenever the police comes in, there's a button, and so they basically destroy all their local software so that nobody can find out what they're actually doing. It's just two examples. We know that Airbnb has provided fake information to New York City, et cetera, et cetera. So this is also very serious, in terms of like abuse of power. Ecology, we said mutualization of underused resources, but it's very important, how do you do this? And here's how Uber does it. By making drivers compete with each other all the time, they force drivers to be on the road all the time. And I've seen this with my own eyes. I lived in Madison, Wisconsin, and I got a tour, and you can see all these Uber drivers are just moving around in the hope to get a client. So they are undermining the great ecological potential of this mutualization. Okay, I think that's enough. Two things about the alternative, because that's also important.
You have plenty of time, though, don't you?
Oh, I do have plenty of time, all right. So what about the alternatives? Well, one of the things I'm working on is called platform cooperatives, right? So what is a platform cooperative? It's not really about sharing, because it's about we are trading with each other, but the platform becomes a commons, right? We are trading, so the platform can be a multi-stakeholder cooperative. What does it mean? Why is it important? Because all the surplus can be reinvested, no, that's not good English, reinvested, that was Dutch, reinvested in the infrastructure and the commons and the commoners. So that's one important thing, and I can announce you that we are working with Smart, which is kind of my employer for the moment, it's a labor mutual, to make a platform ecosystem for platform economy with Berlin, Brussels, and Barcelona. So we are going to mutualize various forms of infrastructure for a healthy cooperative platform economy. The other thing I want to say is there is a real sharing economy. I just want to give, and then I'll kind of wrap it up. I did
You're
a
not allowed
study.
to look at her, you've got to look at me.
All right,
She's gone.
she's
She's
in
out.
Cannes. All right.
I'm in charge
Yes.
of this stage.
All right, Jamie. So this is about Ghent, it's not far away. So I did a study last year for the city of Ghent, it was commissioned by the city, about identifying urban commons in the city. And here's what is happening. There is an exponential growth of civic, commons-oriented initiatives. There were 50 in 2006, there are 500 today in one city. And this is true of Northern Europe, Western Europe, Southern Europe, maybe, I'm not sure about Eastern Europe, but certainly there's data about Northern, Southern, and Western Europe. This is very important because it means that next to these extractive, I call them netarchical, the hierarchy of the network, next to these extractive alternatives, there are actually generative alternatives. And so what are they doing? Well, they provide everything you need in life. So if you want, let's say, housing, you can choose between public housing, which has been decimated over the last 30 years. You can choose private housing, which is now impossible to do for 2/3 of our young people. So the number of people able to buy a house has diminished by 2/3 in the last 20 years. Or you can go to community land trust, the housing co-op, and the co-housing, right? And you can do that for mobility. And so, just one example, and I'm finished. Dégage is a cooperative, non-profit car sharing in Ghent. 100 cars for 1,000 people, right? Instead of 1,500 cars, because people now have more than one car, or at least per family. So the amount of saving of the weight of humanity on the planet is enormous. And this is the real potential of the real sharing economy, not a fake thing that's not about sharing, not about commons. It's pure extraction and precarity. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very good. Very good. Excellent opener, Michel. Very aggressive from the word go. We like that here. You were 9 minutes and 36 seconds, so perfect timing. And next we are going to hear from Judith.
Thank you. Well, it's a great pleasure to be here, and I've never done a formal debate like this, and I think it's a lot of fun. So thanks to everyone who's here. So the first thing I want to say, as Jamie mentioned, I've been studying the sharing economy since 2011. It wasn't even called that at that time. And I've done a variety of kinds of research. We have more than 350 interviews with people who are active in this sector, consumers, members of collectives, as well as people who are earning money on the platforms. We also have a database of 500,000 Airbnb listings, and we've been studying a lot of things about Airbnb as well. So in order to answer, to sort of address this proposition, the most important thing, I think, to start with is to figure out what is the sharing economy. And if you define out any company that is involved with money and profit, that's one thing. But if you look at actually the group of people who consider themselves part of the sharing economy, the initiatives, both the kinds of commons initiatives that Michel was talking about, the time banks that I've studied, the tool libraries, which are very local in nature, gifting and sharing sites like Yerdle and Neighbor Goods and Peerbee and so forth, as well as clothing swaps, repair collectives, neighborhood communications and goods platforms, entities like BlaBlaCar, long-distance carpooling with shared costs, couch surfing, Airbnb without money. That's one whole dimension of the sharing economy. But there are also for-profit companies like Airbnb and others which consider themselves part of the sharing economy, which are part of the community of companies, consultants, and users who form a real institutional entity. They have conferences, they have listservs, they have meetings, and so they are a community of people, all of whom consider themselves involved in sharing activities. So I want to reiterate that the real world entity of the sharing economy is what we need to look at, not just what the parts that we like versus the parts that we don't like. So there's little doubt that most of these entities are involved in sharing, although they are very diverse. They share many things, and they do it in different ways. Now, the big innovation of the sharing economy is the use of information technology to match large numbers of people in peer-to-peer markets through algorithms, plus reputational data, which is crowdsourced on users, so ratings and reputation data, and that the combination of those two things is what's really different about this and what makes stranger exchange, which is another term we can use, much more feasible because of these technologies. And it's opened up the possibility of many new types of trades that allow individuals to retain much more of the value in the transactions that they're involved in and allow them to engage in lots of new transactions. Now, second point, Uber is not part of the sharing economy. So I'm not going to get tagged with all of the horrible things that Uber does. Number one, Uber has always rejected the idea that it's part of the sharing economy. It's been adamant about that. It says it's a logistics company. It never attended any sharing gatherings. And although journalists often lump it together because it's a big platform like Airbnb, there's really nothing about Uber which involves sharing, in contrast to many other of these platforms, including Airbnb, which I'll get back to in a minute. But Uber rejects the values and ethos of sharing. And as my friend Robin Chase, the founder of Zipcar, said, you know, platforms should be your partner if you are somebody who's active on a platform. Uber is your pimp. And I just think we're not going to defend Uber. Now, Uber is an example of a gig, so-called gig labor platform, and people use a different word for it, or an on-demand labor platform. And many analysts exclude these platforms from the sharing economy on the grounds that they're about hiring labor rather than sharing assets, such as apartments or durable goods or a long-distance car ride. And I think there are very few people who include the low-paying platforms like Deliveroo or Uber. And by the way, those are the platforms I was talking about when I said they earn poverty wages. Nobody includes Amazon Mechanical Turk or Upwork. Those are gig labor platforms, and they're a different animal. Okay, so that's number one, definitions. Number two, just because a sharing platform involves money does not mean it's not sharing. This is really crucial. And there are many people who say, well, if it includes money, it's not sharing. And it's a fundamental misunderstanding of what reciprocal economies are really about. So let me just start by saying words are used in many ways. We use the term sharing to discuss all sorts of things. It's, as the linguists say, polysemic, many meaning. So we share meals, we share files, we share confidences, we share our possessions, we even share costs. And so the idea that because there's money involved, it can't be sharing doesn't make sense in the way that many of us understand the word. That's a common confusion. Think about a time bank, okay? In a time bank, a person performs services for others and is quote unquote paid back in services that are done for them. The currency is not money, but it's time, and it's called a time bank or a time currency. Now, nearly everyone considers a time bank a kind of classic sharing economy because we're sharing our time for each other, and yet something very equivalent to money is being exchanged there, the time currency. Now, in my research, as I said, we've interviewed over 350 people in a wide range of sharing initiatives, and they consider platforms like Airbnb to be sharing. Some of our hosts are also active on Couchsurfing, where they give their lodging away free, and they're active on Airbnb at the same time, and they don't see a contradiction with that. In our database of Airbnb listings, more than 40% are shared accommodations in which the guest is in the house, in the accommodation with the host. And if you look at the regulations that are being put in place around the world on Airbnb and similar sites, the ability to be a sort of professional renter is being taken away pretty rapidly. In San Francisco, the number of listings went in half when they put in a regulation. And those are happening all around, and those are going to pull Airbnb back toward its original peer-to-peer character. Historically, economies of reciprocity, and ultimately that's what a commons economy is, or a true sharing economy is, an economy of reciprocity, has always included the exchange of labor, goods, or money. And they don't work historically without that. That has to be a part of it. That's what economic interdependence is about. And I think that the critique of money, the idea that having money in the sharing economy means it's not sharing, confuses two things. One is the critique of capitalism, which we can be very critical of, and I am, with the critique of commercialism and the idea that any market activity is bad. And I mean, I think one of the things that we see about why some of these platforms scaled so rapidly is that people need money. And these platforms have given people an opportunity to earn money in ways that the non-monetized platforms have really struggled to meet people's needs, in part because people have strong needs for money.
1 minute.
Okay, last point. Just because you don't like some of the outcomes doesn't mean there isn't sharing going on. Airbnb is a great case. The users really like it. Cheap accommodation, income for the host. The people who suffer most from Airbnb are the outsiders, people who are not involved, the people who live in the neighborhoods, the people who can't get access to apartments. Of course, all of these things are happening. But the fact that we have some unintended consequences or bad dimensions of the sharing economy, yes, there's a dark side to it. I've written a lot about that dark side. But that doesn't mean it isn't sharing. It just means it's a kind of sharing that we need to change. Last point is the sharing economy will be what we make it. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, if anyone can get closer to 10 minutes exactly, then Judy, I'll be amazed. That's 9 minutes, 57 seconds, point 6.
I had 3 more seconds.
You had under 2.5 seconds to spare there. Imagine what she could have done with that. Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. And now I think we'll turn to Steve.
Thank you. I attended a conference in Florida about a decade ago with a large number of evangelical, religious, third world oriented people, and they had their first experience of a meal in a restaurant in Florida, and they were incensed to find they were expected to pay a tip to the waiters. And I pointed out to them that I thought the average wage for the waiters was well below a living wage, and one of the waitresses heard me saying that and walked up and said, "I heard your discussion. We get paid $3.57 an hour to work the tables." Now, with that news, those people emptied their pockets in giving tips because they realised these people were not really being paid as employees. They were being paid a small amount of money, and they were taking the risk that customers would or wouldn't turn up, not the capitalist who owned the restaurant. So what was being shared in that situation wasn't the revenue, it was the risk. I call that gutless capitalism. And I think what we're seeing in the sharing economy is gutless capitalism, in the sense that the risk of the enterprise is being passed over not to the owners, not to the capitalists, but the ones doing the work inside it. And on that front, I'm going to include Uber in the sharing economy. One thing I know from a lot of my experience in debating, if you get the side of a debate you don't like, you define it in such a way that you win. Okay? You define Uber out of the conversation. I'm sorry, I'm not going to agree to that. Uber is what, even though Uber said it's not, I think it's actually a piece of rank honesty. They're not about sharing, they're about exploiting. But the vision the public has includes Uber and Airbnb and all those various services as part of the sharing economy, and that's what I'm going to be arguing about. Now, with the sharing economy that we actually have in the form of Airbnb and Uber, another element which is being left out of here is we're saying, yes, the users like Airbnb and the users, the people providing it like it, the people in the neighbourhood might not like it for the noise that gets created and so on, but that's a benefit. What about the hotel employees? What happens to the security of tenure of hotel employees who these days have to go along and do untrained internships, unpaid internships to try to get a job somewhere, and they might go to 4 or 5 of those before they finally get paid, if they actually get a job in the industry. Again, this is weakening the hand of the working class, what used to be called the working class, which is now becoming the unemployed class, and strengthening the hand of the owners. And that's a trend which I see this whole so-called sharing economy as being about. It's sharing the risk, it's not sharing the return. And to me, it's a prelude to eliminating the need for workers whatsoever. Now, we know from Michel's figures the tiny amount of money that people working in something like an Uber job. By the way, I came here by an Uber. They're incredibly convenient. They're so convenient, they're such effective technology, of course we use them. But the person who drove me there charged me €5.50 to travel halfway across Brussels, and will probably be earning about €3.50 an hour if he's lucky, which is about 1/4 or 1/5 of the wage you'd need to survive properly in this city. So what's being shared is his livelihood is underwriting my cheap transportation. That's not the sort of sharing that I want to see. And what I also see happening over time is this is just a prelude to getting rid of the workers completely. We've all seen drones. We know that Amazon has developed drones to deliver parcels, which will mean you don't need delivery trucks with delivery drivers inside them anymore. So that's not sharing, that's taking the income away from what used to be workers and putting it in the hand of the companies that now own the drones and can program the drones and make a lot more money out of that than if they were paying the workers to do the delivery. A similar thing with driverless cars. Again, we know that's what's going to happen with Uber. I'm totally in favour of driverless cars in the sense that that technology will drastically reduce the pollution load we do upon the cities. You won't have the drivers moving around because the cars will coordinate electronically and work out the best distribution of cars, and the nearest one will come to you. That'll reduce the carbon footprint of our species on this planet, which we're destroying by the way in which we're mining it right now. So yes, that is a good development, but it will be at the benefit of Uber's owners and not at the benefit of the people of the planet. And that's the real division I think we face by letting this go as far as it's going. Now, the real process we're going through right now is you couldn't have done this 40, 50, 60 years ago. You needed workers to be manning the machines, personing the machines. I better use that term today, hadn't I? I could get worse on that, but I won't try. We couldn't have done it because you needed an industrial working force. You needed a large number of people who'd be coordinated in a factory, who themselves would have to form their own form of communication. I've experienced that working as a process worker at various times in my youth, and I'm glad I have. That's been eliminated by the whole push of neoliberalism, and I see Uber and Airbnb and all the sharing stuff as continuing down that road of weakening the connections we used to have as a working class, as a mass of humanity, versus the people who own the means of production, owns the machinery. And the way we're going, at some point in the not too distant future, there will be no need for unskilled labour in virtually any area of the industry whatsoever. Now, we often say, well, you can retrain, you can get extra skills. There's a level of skill, a level of capacity that is beyond a lot of people that's required to get the jobs that are going to exist. If you can learn how to program in an advanced computer programming language, understand neural networks, work in micron level manufacturing, you might get a job. But the vast majority are not going to have it. And I see this sharing economy as part of a prelude to what could be a very dystopian future. Now, if we need a sharing economy, there's two ways in which I can see us having one. One is things like crowdfunding. I'm actually crowdfunded myself, so I'm quite in favour of that form of sharing. And then the sharing we see there is genuinely what we mean by sharing, which is giving. People are willing to give to something because they like the idea of a new technology, they like the work being done by a particular artist, and they share some of their income so that that particular creative element can be done. That's a good element of sharing. But that's a drop in the bucket next to something like Uber. That's what we should be developing, genuine sharing. But to really get sharing and to really have an income for ourselves in the future, the sharing we need to have is something like a universal basic income. because the days in which poor people without assets, without a means of production of themselves, could actually get an income depended upon effectively being able to blackmail the owners of those machines and say, if you want that machine to turn on, you've got to pay me to press the button. Now, that's going to disappear. And then in that situation, we have two potential outcomes. One is a dystopian future of the Hunger Games, where the vast majority of us are not needed, a tiny majority benefits from the machines, the energy that they manage to harvest and turn into products and services for themselves, and a huge mass of humanity for whom there is no role. Now, the way I see out of that is the genuine sharing of something like a universal basic income. And if that's what I was here debating about, I'd be on the side of that. But that's not what we're talking about today. We're talking about the sharing economy, but what is being shared is the risk of enterprise, not the reward.
Thank you. Steve, thank you very much. Just before I go to Judith, actually, this question of whether Uber is part of the sharing economy or not could be quite important for where this debate actually ends up, couldn't it? Can I just quickly ask, you obviously think that it is.
Yeah.
Do you think that Uber is part of the sharing economy, Michel?
No, but Airbnb isn't either, because that's not sharing. If you're renting something and selling stuff and services, this is not sharing. This is market. Do you think it's reasonable to include Airbnb in the broad public definition and understanding of sharing? Well, if
What
you,
the public thinks it means.
yeah, so if Airbnb is sharing, then Uber is also sharing. So it's very disingenuous to separate them in order to defend the sharing economy.
Okay, quickly.
Uber is not. They've made it pretty clear.
We have a 3-person to 1-person.
Hang on, no we don't.
It's not, I support Julian.
Okay, so, right, well that's helped clear that up. All right, so the lesson is, I won't say anything else, I will go straight to Judith, thank you.
Thank you. So honestly, Steve, I'm rather impressed how you made it from, people shouldn't define what they're talking about or redefining it, but to redefining the sharing economy yourself, to a critique of the future of work, robotics, automation, etc. So yet, I think if we come back to the core, I would very much side with Juliet and say, we need to define the beast and what we're talking about. And what I've seen in the research that I've been doing, so over the past years, we surveyed 4,500 consumers who participate in the sharing economy. And I'll share my definition of it in a second. And we asked them what they do, what they use, why they do it, and how they benefit or don't benefit from it. And we asked that to people in India, in the US, in Germany, to understand if those markets behave similarly or completely differently. And we also talked to 30 founders and CEOs of sharing economy platforms, in particular to find out what they really make money from and what they don't, and how they see their business evolving. What you see in that, indeed, I believe that, yes, the sharing economy is about sharing, and the fact that money changes hands doesn't take away from that at all. I'd also agree with Juliet that in most historic forms of sharing in your community, it didn't mean that there wasn't a price tag attached to that in some shape and form. And that could be the moral obligation towards your neighbor, your aunt, your uncle, whatever. And I'll come back to that in some examples. And I will argue that money changing hands on sharing platforms can actually make it more positive and easier for me to share than if it was about moral obligations or other expectations that will always be attached to sharing. So what I'd argue is indeed asset sharing platforms where I access an asset temporarily that someone else owns, and there might be money involved in doing so, that these platforms are one type, and we call that the sharing economy. And that's very different from labor sharing platforms, and I agree with many of the shortcomings that both Michel and Steve argued. We actually do see from research that a lot of regulation is now starting to spring up to try to make that risk a bit more two-sided when we talk about labor sharing than it is today. And specifically to protect those workers who don't take labor sharing platforms as a supplemental income, which still 3/4 do today, but as their primary source of living. So, but we really believe, Juliet and I, that that's a very different beast, and that's not what we'd like to talk about today. But if we look at the asset sharing platforms, and I'd include Airbnb in that, what are some of the common myths around it? I mean, first, there's always the challenge to say the sharing economy is absolutely not new. It has existed for ages. Yes, I mean, there has been rental out there, right? I mean, we've all rented cars and holiday homes and whatever. And I believe why the sharing economy is really unique as a business model is that, you know, the ubiquity of connected devices, the price of bandwidth coming down, the emerging of more secure, at least, electronic payment systems has led to other assets being shareable, in much smaller slices of time, and, you know, also much lower value goods. Because in the old days, if I rented a car, usually I had to do it for a day. I couldn't pick up my neighbor's car or, you know, someone else's whom I don't even know for 2 hours to run down to the farmer's markets, do my grocery shop, come back. And what we see on sharing platforms that they have really allowed people to access assets they don't own for much shorter slices of time and offered a real alternative to owning this. And that, for me, is a very big difference. And the other big difference to rental models is traditional rental models were very often between a company and an individual. And a lot of the sharing platforms offer a real peer-to-peer exchange between two individuals, and they will allow me as an individual to monetize assets that I own. And those are two of the big differences I actually see. So not all sharing models are created equal, and I believe they structurally differentiate most on the question of who owns that asset. Is that an individual or is it a company? And who sets the price for it? So can I set the price for it, or is it the platform that will dictate that price? And I think we really have to look into the differences of that. So there are some common myths that I think we need to dismantle to understand why there's a lot of beneficial and positive change that platforms have brought about. One is always that question we're debating, you know, sharing economy, sharing platforms are not about sharing. There's another myth that is, this is really just for millennials and mature Western economies. So on a global scale, that actually doesn't matter. So what our research showed us that amongst the 4,500 consumers we surveyed, a lot of platforms in countries like India have seen a much faster uptake. They see more regular usage, and they penetrate much broader parts of society than in some of the mature markets, such as Germany. So actually, it's not just for millennials in mature economies, although yes, it skews a bit towards younger populations because those are usually more tech savvy. A second one is always, well, look, I mean, this will never take root beyond hospitality and mobility, and it will not access broader parts of the economy. So why does it matter? Well, actually it does. And if you look at funding flows, you see that half of the total funding pot that has been pouring into the sharing economy was on mobility and hospitality. But if you look where money is now spent and invested in, it's more peer-to-peer logistics, it's peer-to-peer machinery, it's fashion, it's shared workspaces. So we do believe that it actually does broaden in terms of its reach. And the third myth is very often, well, if that finally takes root, it's just a bothersome threat to the traditional corporation that employed workers, it gave them security, etc. Well, not necessarily. So if you're a traditional company, you can, of course, take that as a threat. And if you look at, you know, the 4 million listings on Airbnb versus 2 million beds of Marriott and Hilton as groups combined, you could say, well, obviously that's a threat. Well, it's not inevitable, right? It's not a threat as a company. If you think about it, you can't react to it. In many ways, I mean, you see that there are companies who will integrate sharing platforms in their own value chain. If you're a small Indian hotel, you will not be able to afford the baby chair and the cot and all the trappings that a tourist will want who comes in. But you can go to RentShare and you can actually access that for a specific client for a specific time. You can create shareable product lines. We see a lot of companies who now create keyless cars, and they take they produce technology that will make sharing easier, and they make money from that. And thirdly, you could, of course, create sharing platforms yourself, such as the German truck manufacturer MAN has done, and they created LoadFox, which is a platform like if you're a little logistics company, you have spare capacity, you can put it on the platform and someone else can fill it. So do I think it's always a threat? It might be, but I think you can actually indeed react to it. And on the other hand, I do believe that the sharing economy does offer a lot of benefits to its customers that you can summarize in probably 4 different arenas. One is it does offer me transparency on the price, on the quality, and on the comparability of what's on there, right? I don't depend on that one holiday rental company in the south of France that tells me the house is this price. So I can look at a very broad set of offerings and I can say, do I believe that's actually a fair price for this house or the camera equipment or whatever it is? Second, it offers me a lot more variety. And I mean, I do acknowledge that Steve argues about, what happens to the hotel employee. Yes, but what do I do if I'm in a city where all the hotels are soulless business hotels? They're bleak. I'm on a camping trip. I want this place that gives me a washing machine where I can wash all the laundry for my children and a place where we can stay while we're 6 people. There was no offering for that for 2 nights before Airbnb was invented or other similar platforms. So in terms of the variety for the individual consumer's needs, I think this is a very beneficial thing. Thirdly, I can monetize my assets if I have them, and we've actually realized that 80% of consumers think about buying a more durable product that will last longer and a product with higher quality if they think they will share it in the end. And fourthly, and I think that can't be overlooked, sharing platforms have created access for the next billion customers who just cannot own, for whom owning is just not an alternative, and who couldn't access a whole range of products because they couldn't afford them. And one of the big platform arenas that's springing up in countries like India are actually agricultural machineries. So platforms like Tringo and Ravgo that offer the individual farmer who could never mechanize actually working his land, the slice of the tractor for a day. And in the original sharing, where I borrowed this from my cousin, I was in moral debt, or I wouldn't get the tractor for the best day of the harvest. On a platform like Tringo, I accessed the tractor for the day I wanted, and so I would argue that actually, despite the fact that in this sharing model, money changes hands, it's the better model of sharing for many people. Thank you.
Thank you. Right. I realised I didn't tell you how long Steve took, because I was getting into that. Well, Steve, you were the shortest. You were about 7.5 minutes. And you came in at 9 minutes 39. I mean, the women are really getting this on at the moment, aren't they? Now, just before we open this up, I want to sort of clear something up here. There is a possibility, a danger that in this debate, on the one side, if we think that Uber is in the sharing economy, we're all going to say, boo, we hate the sharing economy. And if we think the sharing economy is a wonderful way in which workers can collectively get together and do peer-to-peer transactions where there's not a big mean business taking a cut all the time, we'll all cheer and say, fantastic, we love the sharing economy. I don't want the debate to be purely about definitions. There is something in between those two. Airbnb, in a way, is a good example of the thing that kind of fits in the middle. There's money involved. There's a platform that's taking cash for the services they offer. It connects people together, but it does harm in other ways. And I think that, in a sense, is a better kind of frame of mind or a type of model to have in your head when we're thinking about the sharing economy. Now, let's open this one up. We have 20 minutes or so for contributions from you. So raise your hands, and there are people with microphones running around. Don't be shy. I'm like a teacher. I could just sit here in silence and say, yes, we have someone at the front here. A mic's coming to you.
Jamie, do we have a rebut or not?
Yes, while with this. Yeah.
Okay.
I would say that if we're talking about the sharing economy, we're talking only on the side of the assets that are being shared. But if we would talk about a true sharing economy, and the sharing is also sharing the structure that is used, the platforms. It's also sharing the profit. It's sharing the risks. It's sharing should not be something that is only connected to one side of that new ecosystem that's being developed. And there, if you take this with platform co-ops, there's one thing, but how actors relate to each other is the main thing. If in one territory, in a city, if you have one big company that's global that then competes against a tiny startup platform co-op somewhere, there's nothing to do. But if they all get together in one ecosystem and actors get interlinked, then customers would pass from one to each other, and there you can have sharing the platform, sharing the profit, and sharing a number of services that are sort of commons, where you can have labor protection, you can have the logistics, the marketing, and there you can empower the people in a true sharing economy.
Understood. Can I put that maybe to you, Julia? Because there is a tendency with anything that revolves around a large platform to tend towards economies of scale, which tends towards monopolization, which does tend towards more and more monopoly-seeking behavior, even if the intentions start off as good.
Right, and this is an issue of these platform economies in general, you know, whether they have anything to do with sharing or not. If we're thinking about, you know, Facebook, Google, et cetera, these so-called network externalities are so key to them. Platform cooperatives are a very interesting case. I've done, you know, what I think is maybe the first academic study of a platform cooperative, the largest platform cooperative that I know of a workers' cooperative. And the difficulty, I mean, it's wonderful in many ways, but the difficulty is that unlike a Mondragon or a standard workers' cooperative, these are individuals coming, making individual products. It is an extreme winner-take-all market, so that a very small number of people on that platform earn the vast majority of the income that's earned there. And this is going to be an issue for platform co-ops. And I think a really key thing about these platforms is that there's a very diverse, they have very low barriers to entry. Almost anybody can get on them. And so they're extremely diverse workforces in very, very different circumstances. And that's why, and they have very, very different experiences in terms of their earnings, their satisfaction, all of those things. So it's a different animal than sort of a standard business.
Maybe, but the problem is that don't sharing economies usually rely on platforms, and so you always inevitably have a lot of power going to the platform, who runs the platform. And as I think either, I can't remember whether it was Michel or Steve who said this, they can't then cooperate with each other, they can't form unions, because the person that runs the platform always sets the rules.
That's if it's a privately owned platform. The worker co-op it's owned by the workers. So you can govern platforms in lots of different ways. There's not one model to govern platforms, as Michel knows well.
Again, that's not what I think the public thinks the sharing economy means. If the sharing economy meant worker cooperatives, I don't think we'd have an audience. We came to talk about what's actually being done in the name of the sharing economy, as it's portrayed in media. Attempts to spin what's actually going on. What's really being shared is our resources are being shared to create their profits.
Could we have another question, please? Yes, at the back there. Yes, that's coming to you.
I'm going to come back on this as well to ask.
We can't hear you, so could you hold that? Maybe the microphone's not turned on. Yep.
Okay. Can you hear now? Okay.
Close to your mouth and give it a blast, yeah.
I'll try it. Okay. Coming back to this idea, are we talking about the sharing economy or the sharing platform economy? If you go back to barter, ancient times in barter, also more recently in before the wall fell in '89, Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union and all those other countries, they were bartering, even for a doctor's appointment. If somebody needed a doctor's appointment, they'd look around amongst their extended family and friends to say, who had a doctor's appointment that I can give you something else for? And in Israel, for example, that's only one example I can give you, when they started farming, they shared the machinery. There was no platform. Together they bought the machinery and there was no profit from it. But they continued, and today they still share that machinery.
Well, I think that's a good point, but I think these days we do think of a platform as being quite an essential part of what the sharing economy is, because it allows the scale of strangers, you know, you said strangers coming together to trade. Could I?
I mean, I'd argue that what we call the sharing economy, which are indeed platforms, will never be the only form of sharing, right? I mean, I think it will take many different forms. It will take the forms of the informal networks you describe, where you basically exchange on who needs his doctor's appointment most. I mean, I live in a 600 people farmers village, right, in southern Germany. It's totally normal that you don't own a lot of assets, and it's expected that you share them. No one would call an Uber. I mean, you knock on your neighbor's door and you said, can you run me down to the lake? But you will always have these. I think, I'd hope you would also have these, what you describe more as communal workers' platforms. I think the question at hand we debated, will you also have the platform businesses that don't emerge so much from the commons idea and that are not informal and will be more difficult to scale, but will they keep existing as a business, and how do we manage them for a force for good?
Michel, do you want to come?
There's something I really want to stress is that, because the impression we got from to defend the sharing economy is that it's like we're hippies and we don't want to talk about money. Not at all. This is not what we're saying. It's more what the first question was, or the first contribution was, is that it's how is the money being exchanged? What is happening with that money? What's the governance and the property of these platforms? This is what matters, not that nobody can use any money. This is not what we were saying. So this is the first point. The second point is that, and this is maybe a critique on Stocksy, which is the company I think you're implied that you're researching. It's not enough just to, go on the market and then own the platform. There is, because what the so-called sharing economy is doing is basically destroying the basis of the welfare state. Yeah. So what's happening is, and I say to these young people in front, in Holland, the ZZP, zelfstandige zonder personeel, 12.5% of the population, and another half of the freelancer, and in France, the auto-entrepreneur, they are the fastest impoverishing social group in Western society. These are people who will not have pensions. They sometimes don't have health insurance right now. They are under the minimum wage. And this is all happening here. And so it matters a lot. And it actually also matters for the capitalists, because this is what you said. And let me be very clear. If they do this, robotics and AI, and they automatize all these jobs, who is going to buy their products?
But that's a slightly different issue, the automation.
Because this so-called sharing economy is one of the major agents of precarization. So we need to make sure that, yes, we need the mutualization of underused resources. Yes, we need platforms that put into contact peers, but it has to happen in a certain way. It can be the Wild West that it is today, and that is actually destroying the social contract that we had for 100 years.
Please come back in on this.
Yes, you have it backwards, which is the sharing economy is not destroying the welfare state. You've had a tax on the welfare state since the 1980s. The sharing economy is a response to the growth of precarious labor, the decline of full-time employment, all of those things. If you look at why so many people flock to these platforms, they came out of the Great Recession. It was many young people who were graduating into a labor market that had no jobs for them, and this was the only way they could earn money. It's actually a teensy fraction of people who are employed on these platforms, even if you include Uber, which is by far the biggest one. So you've got it upside down. It's a response. You may think that long-term it's going to end up going there, but it's actually these forces that you're talking about. I mean, suddenly Amazon is part of the sharing economy. I mean, these are much larger forces that are a lot of bad things happening, but to sort of lay them all at the feet of the sharing economy, I think is just, it's not in line with the size and the impact now. It maybe is a future you're imagining, but these things are also getting regulated. And who knows if Uber even has a viable business model. It's subsidizing every ride at 40%.
Steve, were you a little bit over-generous in your definition of a sharing economy when you spoke?
I think I'm talking about what people's perception is, and they include Uber and Airbnb in that perception, and anything which actually has the public owning a resource, which is then somehow pooled by one of these platforms to be sold, and the person who owns the resource, whether it's a car or a house, gets part of the revenue. But what they're doing it not because it's a nice sharing thing. It's, as you said, it's because they were wiped out by the Great Recession and there's not enough welfare. Welfare's been eliminated. That was a form of sharing economy. A genuine welfare system is saying we will share what our society produces. Now, instead, they're caught up in this thing where it's been, that side of sharing has been eliminated. Well, certainly in America, it's been pushed down very badly. Anglo-Saxon countries the same way. In that circumstance, you'll reach out to what the capitalists are offering on these platforms. That's far from what we mean by sharing. Again, you're sharing the risk, you're not sharing the return. You're getting a much lower benefit out of that than you would have got out of the old-fashioned welfare state.
Okay, questions again, please. God, there's a lot of cards. This is always how it goes, isn't it? We've got one right at the back there.
Hi.
Hello.
So, hello, I'm Brice. So today's debate is about, is the sharing economy about sharing? So I'd like for 1 minute to reflect on the meaning of the word sharing, because I believe that it changed a lot since the birth of digital. In the past, goods were made of atoms, so sharing meant dividing. Jesus would divide a piece of bread in pieces, all right? Since we entered the digital era, sharing means multiplying. If I share that video or book or game with you, I will multiply it. Of course, in the past, you could share an information. That would mean dividing or multiplying. And today, you can still share a pizza and divide it. But still, the overall meaning of share can vary from dividing to multiply, the same word. So my question is, the sharing economy is not about sharing as multiplying added value, or the sharing economy is not about sharing, meaning dividing value. That changed everything about the question.
That's an interesting way of putting it, actually. Whether sharing, sharing does have more than one meaning. Sometimes it's dividing assets, sometimes it's multiplying assets, especially when it comes to information. How do you see that?
No, I definitely agree, and you see that our definition of the sharing economy platforms is one version of that, because we can share the pizza and it goes away and we can't eat it twice, right? We can share an asset like a bicycle on a platform, and that means more people can use it in little slices of time, so it gets used more overall, but it's not gone afterwards, it's still there. So I indeed believe we talk about different versions of sharing.
Michel.
Yeah, this is a really good question because you can see the difference. So if you participate in an open source project, right, you're sharing knowledge. And on Wikipedia and Linux platforms, you can see everything that is happening, who's doing what, who's contributing. Look at Uber and Airbnb, you can't see anything, right? They control the link between supply and demand. There's an opaque layer of algorithms. And if you have a dispute with Uber, you're out, right? So this is a very good point, because that they're not doing that. They're not sharing. Facebook is not sharing the data. They're selling your data to businesses to make a profit. So this is very important. They're not sharing. They're not multiplying. They are enclosing the data from our interaction. And they're not even creating open markets. They're creating markets that are manipulated for their benefit, profit, and for bringing down the cost of the things they offer. Yeah. And augmenting the power of demand. They systematically design this in their platforms. That's why it matters who controls and manages these platforms.
Yeah, I think that's a very good question, for the reason it points out why most of you are here. Because we know there's sophistry behind the use of the word sharing, which is about giving away something you have to somebody else in a generous way, and twisting it to say that's what Uber or Airbnb are doing, for that matter. And in fact, they're exploiting, they're not sharing. It's not a giving, it's not handing around the loaves and fishes, it's taking away the fish.
So there has been the occasional misuse of this word by companies themselves, hasn't there? And at the end of the day, sharing economy it's good. You got to include the good things, the things that you like and the things you don't like. It's all part of the same sharing economy.
Well, that's exactly what I said. And I really do want to emphasize this point, that Uber does not consider itself part of the sharing
We're banning
economy.
the word Uber on this stage. No more discussion of Uber.
But let's think about Airbnb for a second. I mean, the point of saying it's that people are sharing accommodation is not to say that everything about it is wonderful. Airbnb takes a relatively small fraction compared to other platforms. And that's why people stay on the platform with Airbnb. You don't see a lot of people going off because it's also providing insurance, means of payment, and so forth. And they've kept their fees relatively low in comparison to some other platforms that are gouging users and they go off. Or the huge commissions, I'm sorry, that Uber takes. Much bigger fraction. With Airbnb, the value is staying more with the renters, or the guests and the hosts, and particularly for the people who are doing shared accommodation, which is what they will call it, they're getting numerous other benefits. We've interviewed many of these people. They have sociability. Sometimes they make long-term relationships. The idea that this is just a purely exploitative enterprise, I just think is wrong. I think Airbnb is the one to really focus on, to think about, okay, is there sharing going on here? You may not like, as I don't, a lot of the other impacts of it. But it's a much purer case that I think we can focus on.
Okay, there's a hand up over there. I'm sorry, a lot of hands are going up. I can't get to them all, so you, sir.
Hello. Just because you speak about Airbnb, I have a question. On market, when you say it's not anymore a share economy, when you have more than 30% of all ads of investors. I remember that I read an article about the ads in Amsterdam, and I cannot remember exactly the numbers, but at least 30% of all ads were of people who were owning more than one property.
Okay.
And another question,
sorry,
and I finish.
Because I understand exactly the question, and it's quite an important one actually. Can I take another question as well, though? Because I want to make sure we get a couple more in. You at the front, sir, and then we'll go back to the panel.
Thank you. I'd like to talk here as a teenager and...
Could you put the microphone a little closer?
And more as a millennial that has seen all of these grow. And I know I may just be a teenager, but I think that the growing economy the growing sharing economy that has been shown and that has been discussed here is very important, because the sharing economy is our future. The people sitting here in the front, it's our future. And I think that the notion of sharing is a very important one, as it's the way to connect societies, the way to connect generations, to connect people, it's the way to connect a society. And I think that notion is a very important one, and it's a way that not only the producer, the supplier, but also the consumer can profit from. But the way that I've seen it, not necessarily only tonight, but throughout the whole of my life, is which hasn't been very long. Let's be real here. But is that nowadays the way that people share is through platforms, and they are obviously the most important part. And the platforms are basically the reasons why people will join into these big groups like Airbnb, like Uber, and big companies like that. It's the people at the top and the people working in that company that aren't giving the most. I think it's the people down here at the bottom that are giving the most. And the work is essentially happening here. And the reason why people are being employed is because they have the big connection of this site where many people can connect, and where the consumer technically meets the supplier.
Okay. Thank you very much, young man. That's a really interesting point about the culture. You know, we're creating a positive culture of sharing here. Maybe you don't like some of the side effects, but overall that's quite good, isn't it?
Yeah, but I think the way I'd prefer to see sharing is that unless we get sharing of income at the absolute national, almost global level, where we make sure everybody gets enough income to be able to live, then we face a dystopia where unless we manage to get that agreement that we are all part of humanity and the basic standard of living has to be assured for everyone on the planet, then we're going to a world where only a tiny minority gets the benefit of the technologies and the platforms we're creating right now, and that will be a very unpleasant world. And I'm rather pessimistic about our chance of avoiding that.
We've got that already, I think. But something about the gentleman's question about the fact is that Airbnb very positive, people use it, but actually it's becoming centralized, and a small number of landowners or householders who have several properties actually make up the majority of the rentals.
I think the interesting thing is, and I'd love to take your Airbnb example. I mean, you know, Airbnb lives of local scale. If they move to a new city and they can't have a variety of an offering, the platform doesn't properly work. So whenever they went into new cities, what we very often saw that they tried to get landlords who were commercial landlords, who offered a lot of, I'd say, cookie-cutter properties, right? That didn't feel so different from a temporary corporate housing. It actually has damaged the brand, and I guess Judith has seen that very much in her data, that what people will gravitate towards are very much the individual assets you find on the platform. So yes, do you have commercial users, hosts? Yes. Will you want to regulate them so that they pay taxes like a small hotel that might have a similar amount of assets? Absolutely yes. But I think what you've seen and what is rather interesting is that the more you had very commercial assets, the less it fit the brand promise, and consumers actually didn't like it, which I think is quite an interesting dynamic.
Okay, well, I want to take three questions here because I want to get as many of you in as possible. We have a little cluster over there. Where's our microphone, people? Yeah, the sort of middle row there, and behind that lady too.
So I wanted to ask about something that both of you on this side have been alluding to, which is what are the criteria under which the monetization of these sharing platforms continues to equally benefit most producers and most consumers?
Great, sharp question. Love it. Behind you. You just shout. I can hear you. Yeah.
So imagine we are not talking about the broader context you're speaking of the wider world and the future and the sort of huge number of people living on $3 a day on the planet. I just wonder, in the context of consumerism, in the context of acceleration, in fact that we know that in rich countries like Belgium, in rich blocs like Europe, in the OECD, that we need to check on our consumerism and on our acceleration and how it all fits together. How much is this sort of share economy as convenience adding to that? So I need a baby chair at this time, right there, right then, is sort of that part of the share economy. And then there's the other bit that has the social experience. So I think the definition of the share economy has to also somehow include how does it relate also to the idea of social experience and what people need in share?
Okay, great question. Bridie, you're speaking, you're pointing your microphone at the back there. Bridie, is that someone there who wants it? No, well...
Okay, I'll try. So my question was about, we've mentioned worker protection and precarization and things like this, but this question did not exist back in the time when people were sharing without the platform. So isn't the question whether we should allow for sharing to be a job? Isn't the issue that actually we do allow people to try to make a living out of sharing? And is it this the problem in the sharing economy? Should it stay a side activity at the end?
Thank you. Thank you. These are all quite big and difficult questions. Michel, I know you might be able to take all of them on, but please respond.
I'll be very short and I'll just answer the third question. So one of the things we've been involved in at Smart was around Deliveroo bikers. So you have to know they're sitting down on a stoop, and they're not paid when they're waiting and sitting down on the stoop. So they're only paid when they actually get on the bike. And I worked like that in Wendy's back when I was young, and I can tell you I had to get up at 6, clean, sell breakfast time, wait for 3 hours, clean, do the lunch. So I was there like 13, 14 hours, and I was getting paid 5 hours in the United States in 1981. It was terrible. It's just a terrible life that, you're there 13 hours and you're paid 4 hours at the minimum wage, or 5. And this is the situation that was exceptional then is becoming more and more spread with this new model. And this is very bad. So Smart negotiated 3 hours minimum. And it worked for a few months, and they rejected it. They don't want to pay. They want to pay people only. And so you're sitting there, and sure, if you're a student, you make a few $100 extra. It's going to look good. But as a way to make a living, it's absolutely bad. And then that's why I disagree with Juliet about, yes, there was precarity before, and it's one of the reasons it grows, but does it offer a solution? No. It's absolutely stopgap and actually undermines the real solutions. And this is why it's not just the result of precarity, they're active actors in undermining what workers could get in the past.
Would you respond to that point?
I wouldn't want to let traditional corporations get away by saying a lot of the social issues we see today are due to sharing platforms. I completely agree with you, Michel, that we need regulation. But let's take a country like Germany. We have 1 million people working on sharing platforms. That's still a very small fraction. As you know, we've just formed a new government. It has taken nearly as long as usually in Belgium. So the coalition treaty says we have to regulate social benefits for platform workers. And that was a big part of the union. They didn't, negotiate so much on wages. They negotiated on flexibility for people not to work few hours, and they negotiated on saying, look, we need to regulate this. I believe you will need regulations, but that doesn't necessarily challenge the basic business model to say we share assets where we can monetize the time where we don't use them, or we also share slices of labor that we don't use. But just because it's still unregulated, the Industrial Revolution saw unregulated capitalism. We needed to regulate it. Still, the model has been the most successful we've invented. I'd be happy if we come up with something better. But, since the 1700s, we haven't gotten there.
That second question, Julia, I want to put that to you because there's a sort of cultural side to this. I mean, are we losing something in society when we can share everything everybody else has got immediately, conveniently, we push a button, we get what we want straight away? Yeah, it might be convenient, but is it actually helping society more generally?
So I think it's a great question, and one of the things about the sharing economy, like every other economy, is it's very varied. And so you've got platforms in there doing, very different things. On the one hand, you have the sort of growth of the idea that you don't need to own things and you can get access instead, and so that sort of works against consumerism. On the other hand, you have the part of, I call it the servant economy, or it's a certain portion of the gig economy. I don't consider it sharing economy, which is basically what you're talking about. It's sort of wealthy people who, instead of having to employ servants full times, can now use these apps to get basically servant labor at a very cheap price. And that is accelerating a certain kind of on-demand consumerism for sure. But I would say that's the gig labor economy. That's not the sharing economy.
Well, Deliveroo is a share. Well, because it's restaurants that now everybody can access more easily from home, and so their resources are being used more efficiently because they can suddenly share their kitchen, or if you like, with people at home. I mean, it's part of the same thing.
I've never heard that rhetoric. There are actual platforms of kind of meal sharing. Like if you have leftovers, there's a platform that can get them to somebody else.
Another round of questions, please. I think we probably have time for just statements, of course, statements as well as questions. Please just speak your mind too. I think we've probably got room for one more round. of 3. So, gentleman in the stripy shirt there.
Thank you. Hello, I'm Luc. If you take this discussion and you compare it to the way that banks have sold their ethical products, you arrive at the same type of discussion. Sure, we're doing ethical stuff now. We're still banks. We're still there to make money. And you have dividing and multiplying. They're not in that debate. The same thing is with the pirates who claim the sharing economy. They're bloody pirates. Wouldn't it, and that's my question, wouldn't it be possible to create a sort of a slider or a sort of a set of parameters that can define what we really think that sharing is? Does it have to be an ethical thing? What is it? Is it people? Is it planet? Is it profit? And for each of these, how can you then define that? Maybe there is a sort of a system that you can define with a scorecard that says this small or big initiative, it's true sharing because it has high ratings all over the map.
Okay, right. We'll maybe come to you over the drinks and see the scorecard that you can come up with, because that sounds interesting and very, very difficult to put together. A question over here behind you.
Hello, I'm Thibault. When talking about the sharing economy, for me, I think the main argument to attract a lot of customers or a lot of users is actually the price. If you look to why do people use Uber, because the price is much lower than a taxi. Why do people go on Airbnb with their houses? Because they can earn a quick buck without investing much, or even like the users, Airbnb it's much cheaper than a hotel, so we're going to use Airbnb. I think we must ask ourselves, why are these prices much lower than regular prices? Okay, there's a small increase in competition, and there's some gains to be won by that. That's a common argument in the taxi sector, although I don't know many taxi drivers who are very rich, actually. So are we actually talking about the sharing economy, or is it sharing, or is it more the economy? And I have the feeling it's more about the economy doing it, and yeah, it's just like a Dutch word. It's like doing something economics, that you earn something, or you do like something more cheaply.
Okay, another question. We haven't had anyone from the very, very back, so I can work the people running the mics, so they get a bit of exercise rather than sitting around in Ubers all day. Let's take yours.
Name is Kenny. I was just wondering why we call it the sharing economy, because do we share, or do we just optimize assets we don't have to use at that moment? And is it not an economy which is based on surplus? And is it wrong to benefit from surplus? But is it really sharing? Does it come from a philanthropy part of nature, or is it just optimizing monetary value? Like, we don't need the house at this moment, let's get some money for it. We don't need the car. And those platforms, just a means to an end.
Okay,
no?
Yeah. You know what, I've just been given the sign that I'm allowed to do another round of a few questions, so we might get you in, but... Oh, now, sorry, we are in communication, it's very, very bad. I'll take a couple more now. I'm not really the boss on this panel at all, I'm actually being directed from someone over here. Lady there had her hand up before with the jumper, I think.
Hello. So we kind of all agreed that we need regulation for this kind of activities, but I was wondering whether it's not a challenge to regulate an activity that you don't really control. So you can easily enter an hotel and check for security standards, but can you do that for Airbnb, for instance? So yes, there is a need for it, but can we actually do it?
That's an interesting point. Yeah, we talk about regulation, but is there something about the sharing economy that actually makes it harder to really regulate? Keep that in mind. I'm going to take Another one from you, madam. Oh, I thought you were pointing at someone behind you.
So the sharing economy is giving us access to assets that we don't normally have access to. And is there a danger, like with the drug industry, for example, that we're actually going to have access to things that traditionally we wouldn't normally want people to have access to? So nowadays, you can actually access drugs with a lot more transparency. People know who they're getting them from. They can actually give reviews of the people who are providing them with drugs and what quality they are. And is there a danger to this in that this sharing economy actually means that we're sharing things that could be quite dangerous to our society?
Okay, and we might end up sharing everything, and there's nothing beyond the reach of these platforms. I might take one more comment, and then what I'm going to do is ask the guys here to sum up, actually. So one more, and it is International Women's Day, so I can see a woman who's with her hand up over there. Yes.
I'm going to bring in one slightly different issue, and that's the issue of scale. You already mentioned it a little bit, but I think it's very important because I feel there's something like a break-even point in scale of the smaller things being more ethical, also knowing each other or getting some sort of idea about a community that you have contact with versus something that is getting more and more impersonal and larger, and that other people and other people have to take over the contacts. So I was wondering if you could say something to that, because I think there's some line on the ethical part also between the small scale and the larger scale.
Are you suggesting that the larger it gets, somehow the more unethical it becomes?
In a way, because it gets more commercial, it gets it more unpersonal, and then people can take over some things because it's more. I don't find the word.
But of course, the services get better the bigger they become because you have more things that you can share, and maybe that's one of the sort of the tensions within this whole model. Now, thank you. And thank you, all of you, for your contributions. I'm sorry I can't take any more because we're running short time. And what I'm going to ask, we have one person from each side to make concluding arguments. And it's going to draw on some of the questions that you've just given, the comments that you've just made, but also from the whole discussion. You're conferring already over here. We've already got you down, Julia, as being the person that's summing this up. Steve, we've given you 3 to 5 minutes to sum up with your concluding remarks, and then it's going to be Juliet. Please. Well, you can stand up. Why don't you stand up to get people riled?
I think the whole idea of sharing is about saying we've got a pie and we're going to slice it up in some relatively fair way. And that's the opposite of what the so-called sharing economy has been about. And frankly, it's the opposite of how our species has behaved. There is a tendency in humanity, and we should be amplifying that, to be egalitarian. It's something which does distinguish us from some of the other simians. We don't, but we also have the tendency to have hierarchies develop and to have the big man syndrome, and I will use that term on International Women's Day. The dominant male, the person who takes the large share of the cake. He might look orange, I don't know. But that type of behaviour is one of the extremes of humanity. Now, the capitalist economy, which, as it's developed, has pushed an ideology that gives you the best of all possible worlds. That's, to mention another female who's not quite as politically aligned with this movement as she might be, Ayn Rand. That's her vision, a winner-take-all attitude. Now, that is a negative vision of what's good about humanity. We should be going for the genuine sense of sharing that we all mean by the word, and we all have that collective belief the world would be better that way. Now, the sharing economy, as it's been developed in the last 10 or so years, is not about going in that direction. It's continuing to push the hierarchical nature that society has always had. And we're far from, as one of the people at the back said, it's not about sharing, it's about optimising the use of available resources. Who can do it? Those who have resources. And even in the area of Airbnb, that comes down to people who own homes. That does not include millennials. It may never include them, given the way the inequality in our society is going. So that what we're doing with this so-called sharing economy is making the inequality of how we divide up the cake even worse. And one issue we've barely even touched upon tonight, but it's absolutely crucial. How are we as a species sharing this planet with all the other species on it? One of the intriguing answers to that I saw recently, one of the reasons it's nice to be on Twitter, is finding obscure but interesting facts. And that is one about what percentage of the mass of the mammals on this planet are either humans or animals that humans are bred to eat. The answer is 90%. So we're not sharing the planet with other species, we're not sharing our control of it with each other, and we're mining the planet while we're doing it and wondering why we're heading towards catastrophe.
Thank you, Steve. Julia.
Thank you. Well, I think one thing that all of us on this stage
Sharing this platform.
agree with, sharing the platform, is that sharing is a good thing. And the question, I think, is, first of all, not do we like contemporary global capitalism, because I am certainly not going to stand up for that system. And I have, many, many critiques, and of course share many of them with my colleagues here. But the question is, does the emergence of this sector, which includes both the small-scale sharing initiatives that I think we would all agree are genuine sharing, as well as some of the larger platforms that we can see are being pulled in the direction, possibly in the direction less in a sharing direction, or are we going to pull them back into the, what we would consider to be more sharing kinds of true sharing? And that gets back to the question of who's on Airbnb, because one of the things that's happening on Airbnb is that those businesses are being kicked off. Airbnb believes now it has a policy of one host, one home. So it is not a predatory business platform. Increasingly, it is going back to those origins. And the point I ended with, which is the sharing economy can be what we want it to be, is that this is a contested space. It's why we're having a discussion like this. But we can regulate these platforms. We can regulate governance issues, transparency issues. We can begin to have workers owning and controlling platforms as well. Not all of these platforms are going to stick around. Competitors, there are platform competitors or cooperative competitors to some of these platforms in the ride-hailing sector, for sure. You don't have to be an owner to be on Airbnb. A very large number of Airbnb hosts are renters, and a very large number of them are millennials. And I think this is really important for us to understand the role that these platforms are playing for a generation. It's not only millennials, but they have been really important for millennials who don't have access. Yes, I would love a much more equal society, absolutely. And that's not the question that we're debating here tonight.
Thank you, Julia. Do we have the results? Do we have? I'm gonna ask you that same question that I asked you at the beginning. So get ready with you. I want to know. Yes, okay. I want to know what the results were first time around, though. Do we have them yet?
So we have 90 out of 160 agreed with this side that the sharing economy is not about sharing.
Okay, 90 out of 160, pretty close.
But we don't know if the rest don't know or know.
Okay. So we have two bits of paper, and if you now agree with the motion, let's get real. The sharing economy is not about sharing. Can you hold up your white card? Just your white card, please.
They can pass them both down because it's one's white and one's yellow.
Okay, pass them down. And if you do not agree with the motion, let's get real. The sharing economy is not about sharing. If you do not agree with that, yellow card, please. Hold them up and pass them down. Yellow cards down. Whichever way you want to send them. There should be people on either side. Okay. Oh yeah, you obviously can only vote once, and you cannot share your vote with anybody else. You can't split your vote up 5 ways and divvy it up and sell it on, nothing like that. One person, one vote. There's some at the back as well. Runners, there's some at the back. And there's a couple at the front here too. Anyone not given their vote in yet? Anyone not given their vote in? We have a card over here. And given where we are with voter fraud, interference in elections, I do hope everybody has correctly played by the rules of this game. Okay. Now, we have an exciting count going on over in the corner. They told me that my job was to keep everybody excited and on tenterhooks. So I don't really know.
The thing that's going to be bad is not only if we lose, but that more people disagree with us.
Drum roll. We're nearly there. They're hard at work, I can see them, don't worry. The counting's coming. Do we have a... Oh.
57, yes, with Steve. The sharing economy is not about sharing. 39 with these two.
So that went down.
Yes.
So, but they won. But
yeah, exactly.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, please. We have the results. Oh, it's like the Oscars. It's really exciting, and I'm going to get the results right. Okay. Now, so I'm just going to give you numbers here, not percentages or anything like that. Okay. So let's get real. The sharing economy is not about sharing. 57 people agree with that statement, and 39 people disagree with that statement, which means that the agrees have won the debate and carried the motion. However, I must add that first of all, in the first count, 90 people agreed with that motion, and it went down to 57 from 90. So in a sense, you swayed the opinion, but you guys won the vote. So well done to both of them.